the new God of peace, the new gods of peace, the new God of peace, the new goddess of peace, the new goddesses of peace, the new goddess of peace, the old God of peace, the old gods of peace, the old God of peace, the old goddess of peace, the old goddesses of peace, the old goddess of peace, the greater God of peace, the greater gods of peace, the greater God of peace, the greater goddess of peace, the greater goddesses of peace, the greater goddess of peace, the lesser God of peace, the lesser gods of peace, the lesser God of peace, the lesser goddess of peace, the lesser goddesses of peace, the lesser goddess of peace, the higher God of peace, the higher gods of peace, the higher God of peace, the higher goddess of peace, the higher goddesses of peace, the higher goddess of peace, the lower God of peace, the lower gods of peace, the lower God of peace, the lower goddess of peace, the lower goddesses of peace, the lower goddess of peace, the greater spirit of peace, the greater spirits of peace, the greater spirit of peace, the lesser spirit of peace, the lesser spirits of peace, the lesser spirit of peace, the higher spirit of peace, the higher spirits of peace, the higher spirit of peace, the lower spirit of peace, the lower spirits of peace, the lower spirit of peace, the major God of peace, the major gods of peace, the major God of peace, the major goddess of peace, the major goddesses of peace, the major goddess of peace, the minor God of peace, the minor gods of peace, the minor God of peace, the minor goddess of peace, the minor goddesses of peace, the minor goddess of peace, the superior God of peace, the superior gods of peace, the superior God of peace, the superior goddess of peace, the superior goddesses of peace, the superior goddess of peace, the inferior God of peace, the inferior gods of peace, the inferior God of peace, the inferior goddess of peace, the inferior goddesses of peace, the inferior goddess of peace, the ancestor God of peace, the ancestor gods of peace, the ancestor God of peace, the ancestor goddess of peace, the ancestor goddesses of peace, the ancestor goddess of peace, the ascendant God of peace, the ascendant gods of peace, the ascendant God of peace, the ascendant goddess of peace, the ascendant goddesses of peace, the ascendant goddess of peace, the descendant God of peace, the descendant gods of peace, the descendant God of peace, the descendant goddess of peace, the descendant goddesses of peace, the descendant goddess of peace, the transcendent God of peace, the transcendent gods of peace, the transcendent God of peace, the transcendent goddess of peace, the transcendent goddesses of peace, the transcendent goddess of peace, the past God of peace, the past gods of peace, the past God of peace, the past goddess of peace, the past goddesses of peace, the past goddess of peace, the present God of peace, the present gods of peace, the present God of peace, the present goddess of peace, the present goddesses of peace, the present goddess of peace, the future God of peace, the future gods of peace, the future God of peace, the future goddess of peace, the future goddesses of peace, the future goddess of peace, the authentic God of peace, the authentic gods of peace, the authentic God of peace, the authentic goddess of peace, the authentic goddesses of peace, the authentic goddess of peace, the synthetic God of peace, the synthetic gods of peace, the synthetic God of peace, the synthetic goddess of peace, the synthetic goddesses of peace, the synthetic goddess of peace, the progressive God of peace, the progressive gods of peace, the progressive God of peace, the progressive goddess of peace, the progressive goddesses of peace, the progressive goddess of peace, the regressive God of peace, the regressive gods of peace, the regressive God of peace, the regressive goddess of peace, the regressive goddesses of peace, the regressive goddess of peace, the ordinary god of peace, the ordinary gods of peace, the ordinary god of peace, the ordinary goddess of peace, the ordinary goddesses of peace, the ordinary goddess of peace, the extraordinary god of peace, the extraordinary gods of peace, the extraordinary god of peace, the extraordinary goddess of peace, the extraordinary goddesses of peace, the extraordinary goddess of peace, the static god of peace, the static gods of peace, the static god of peace, the static goddess of peace, the static goddesses of peace, the static goddess of peace, the dynamic god of peace, the dynamic gods of peace, the dynamic god of peace, the dynamic goddess of peace, the dynamic goddesses of peace, the dynamic goddess of peace, the land god of peace, the land gods of peace, the land god of peace, the land goddess of peace, the land goddesses of peace, the land goddess of peace, the sea god of peace, the sea gods of peace, the sea god of peace, the sea goddess of peace, the sea goddesses of peace, the sea goddess of peace, the sky god of peace, the sky gods of peace, the sky god of peace, the sky goddess of peace, the sky goddesses of peace, the sky goddess of peace, the god of peace, the gods of peace, the god of peace, the goddess of peace, the goddesses of peace, the goddess of peace, the half god of peace, the half gods of peace, the half god of peace, the half goddess of peace, the half goddesses of peace, the half goddess of peace, the vessel of peace, the vessels of peace, the vessel of peace, the name of peace, the names of peace, the name of peace, the person of peace, the persons of peace, the person of peace, the persona of peace, the personas of peace, the persona of peace, the personage of peace, the personages of peace, the personage of peace, the personality of peace, the personalities of peace, the personality of peace, the personification of peace, the personifications of peace, the personification of peace, the image of peace, the images of peace, the image of peace, the imagination of peace, the imaginations of peace, the imagination of peace, the belief of peace, the beliefs of peace, the belief of peace, the thought of peace, the thoughts of peace, the thought of peace, the word of peace, the words of peace, the word of peace, the action of peace, the actions of peace, the action of peace, the reaction of peace, the reactions of peace, the reaction of peace, the feeling of peace, the feelings of peace, the feeling of peace, the situation of peace, the situations of peace, the situation of peace, the circumstance of peace, the circumstances of peace, the circumstance of peace, the environment of peace, the environments of peace, the environment of peace, the relationship of peace, the relationships of peace, the relationship of peace, the number of peace, the numbers of peace, the number of peace, the formula of peace, the formulas of peace, the formula of peace, the equation of peace, the equations of peace, the equation of peace, the theory of peace, the theories of peace, the theory of peace, the symbol of peace, the symbols of peace, the symbol of peace, the color of peace, the colors of peace, the color of peace, the thing of peace, the things of peace, the thing of peace, the way of peace, the ways of peace, the way of peace, the place of peace, the places of peace, the place of peace, the time of peace, the times of peace, the time of peace, the event of peace, the events of peace, the event of peace, the result of peace, the results of peace, the result of peace, the crown of peace, the crowns of peace, the crown of peace, the throne of peace, the thrones of peace, the throne of peace, the peace king, the peace kings, the peace kingdom, the peace kingdoms, the peace king subject, the peace king subjects, the peace king's dominion, the peace king's dominions, the kingdom of peace, the kingdoms of peace, the kingdom of peace, the peace queen, the peace queens, the peace queendom, the peace queendoms, the peace queen subject, the peace queen subjects, the peace queen's dominion, the peace queen's dominions, the queendom of peace, the queendoms of peace, the queendom of peace, the peace prince, the peace princes, the peace princedom, the peace princedoms, the peace prince's subject, the peace prince's subjects, the peace prince's dominion, the peace prince's dominions, the princedom of peace, the princedoms of peace, the princedom of peace, the peace princess, the peace princesses, the peace princessdom, the peace princessdoms, the peace princess's subject, the peace princess's subjects, the peace princess's dominion, the peace princess's dominions, the princessdom of peace, the princessdoms of peace, the princessdom of peace, the Lord of peace, the lords of peace, the Lord of peace, the lordess of peace, the lordesses of peace, the lordess of peace, the priest of peace, the priests of peace, the priest of peace, the priestess of peace, the priestesses of peace, the priestess of peace, the ritual of peace, the rituals of peace, the ritual of peace, the shrine of peace, the shrines of peace, the shrine of peace, the temple of peace, the temples of peace, the temple of peace, the leader of peace, the leaders of peace, the leader of peace, the follower of peace, the followers of peace, the follower of peace, the natural substance of peace, the natural substances of peace, the natural substance of peace, the supernatural substance of peace, the supernatural substances of peace, the supernatural substance of peace, the temporal substance of peace, the temporal substances of peace, the temporal substance of peace, the spiritual substance of peace, the spiritual substances of peace, the spiritual substance of peace, the natural form of peace, the natural forms of peace, the natural form of peace, the supernatural form of peace, the supernatural forms of peace, the supernatural form of peace, the temporal form of peace, the temporal forms of peace, the temporal form of peace, the spiritual form of peace, the spiritual forms of peace, the spiritual form of peace, the age of peace, the ages of peace, the age of peace, the era of peace, the eras of peace, the era of peace, the awakener of peace, the awakeners of peace, the awakener of peace, the awakening of peace, the awakenings of peace, the awakening of peace, the realm of peace, the realms of peace, the realm of peace, the dimension of peace, the dimensions of peace, the dimension of peace, the zone of peace, the zones of peace, the zone of peace, the frequency of peace, the frequencies of peace, the frequency of peace, the century of peace, the centuries of peace, the century of peace, the millennium of peace, the millenniums of peace, the millennium of peace, the purpose of peace, the purposes of peace, the purpose of peace, the meaning of peace, the meanings of peace, the meaning of peace, the culture of peace, the cultures of peace, the culture of peace, the demonstrator of peace, the demonstrators of peace, the demonstrator of peace, the demonstration of peace, the demonstrations of peace, the demonstration of peace, the manifester of peace, the manifestors of peace, the manifester of peace, the manifestation of peace, the manifestations of peace, the manifestation of peace, the presence of peace, the presences of peace, the presence of peace, the glow of peace, the glows of peace, the glow of peace, the goal of peace, the goals of peace, the goal of peace, the plan of peace, the plans of peace, the plan of peace, the book of peace, the books of peace, the book of peace, the philosopher of peace, the philosophers of peace, the philosopher of peace, the philosophy of peace, the philosophies of peace, the philosophy of peace, the releaser of peace, the releasers of peace, the releaser of peace, the release of peace, the releases of peace, the release of peace, the variable of peace, the variables of peace, the variable of peace, the cause of peace, the causes of peace, the cause of peace, the effect of peace, the effects of peace, the effect of peace, the journey of peace, the journeys of peace, the journey of peace, the emergence of peace, the emergences of peace, the emergence of peace, the source of peace, the sources of peace, the source of peace, the originator of peace, the originators of peace, the originator of peace, the origin of peace, the origins of peace, the origin of peace, the forefather of peace, the forefathers of peace, the forefather of peace, the foremother of peace, the foremothers of peace, the foremother of peace, the ancestor of peace, the ancestors of peace, the ancestor of peace, the descendant of peace, the descendants of peace, the descendant of peace, the lineage of peace, the lineages of peace, the lineage of peace, the heritage of peace, the heritages of peace, the heritage of peace, the heir of peace, the heirs of peace, the heir of peace, the co-heir of peace, the co-heirs of peace, the co-heir of peace, the joint heir of peace, the joint heirs of peace, the joint heir of peace, the dynasty of peace, the dynasties of peace, the dynasty of peace, the force of peace, the forces of peace, the force of peace, the law of peace, the laws of peace, the law of peace, the pact of peace, the pacts of peace, the pact of peace, the game of peace, the games of peace, the game of peace, the mask of peace, the masks of peace, the mask of peace, the armor of peace, the armors of peace, the armor of peace, the sword of peace, the swords of peace, the sword of peace, the shield of peace, the shields of peace, the shield of peace, the force shield of peace, the force shields of peace, the force shield of peace, the armored force shield of peace, the armored force shields of peace, the armored force shield of peace, the champion of peace, the champions of peace, the champion of peace, the guardian of peace, the guardians of peace, the guardian of peace, the defender of peace, the defenders of peace, the defender of peace, the protector of peace, the protectors of peace, the protector of peace, the chant of peace, the chants of peace, the chant of peace, the shape of peace, the shapes of peace, the shape of peace, the cube of peace, the cubes of peace, the cube of peace, the cuboid of peace, the cuboids of peace, the cuboid of peace, the sphere of peace, the spheres of peace, the sphere of peace, the spheroid of peace, the spheroids of peace, the spheroid of peace, the prism of peace, the prisms of peace, the prism of peace, the pyramid of peace, the pyramids of peace, the pyramid of peace, the cylinder of peace, the cylinders of peace, the cylinder of peace, the cone of peace, the cones of peace, the cone of peace, the triangle of peace, the triangles of peace, the triangle of peace, the circle of peace, the circles of peace, the circle of peace, the semicircle of peace, the semicircles of peace, the semicircle of peace, The square of peace. The squares of peace. The square of peace. The rectangle of peace. The rectangles of peace. The rectangle of peace. The parallelogram of peace. The parallelograms of peace. The parallelogram of peace. The rhombus of peace. The rhombuses of peace. The rhombus of peace. The trapezoid of peace. The trapezoids of peace. The trapezoid of peace. The polygon of peace. The polygons of peace. The polygon of peace. The pentagon of peace. The pentagons of peace. The pentagon of peace. The hexagon of peace. The hexagons of peace. The hexagon of peace. The septagon of peace. The septagons of peace. The septagon of peace. The octagon of peace. The octagons of peace. The octagon of peace. The nonagon of peace. The nonagons of peace. The nonagon of peace. The decagon of peace. The decagons of peace. The decagon of peace. The evolution of peace. The evolutions of peace. The evolution of peace. The revolution of peace. The revolutions of peace. The revolution of peace. The elemental art of peace. The elemental arts of peace. The elemental art of peace. The elemental science of peace. The elemental sciences of peace. The elemental science of peace. The elemental principle of peace. The elemental principles of peace. The elemental principle of peace. The elemental technology of peace. The elemental technologies of peace. The elemental technology of peace. The low elemental art of peace. The low elemental arts of peace. The low elemental art of peace. The low elemental science of peace. The low elemental sciences of peace. The low elemental science of peace. The low elemental principle of peace. The low elemental principles of peace. The low elemental principle of peace. The low elemental technology of peace. The low elemental technologies of peace. The low elemental technology of peace. The high elemental art of peace. The high elemental arts of peace. The high elemental art of peace. The high elemental science of peace. The high elemental sciences of peace. The high elemental science of peace. The high elemental principle of peace. The high elemental principles of peace. The high elemental principle of peace. The high elemental technology of peace. The high elemental technologies of peace. The high elemental technology of peace. The agent of peace. The agents of peace. The agent of peace. The agency of peace. The agencies of peace. The agency of peace. The amplifier of peace. The amplifiers of peace. The amplifier of peace. The amplification of peace. The amplifications of peace. The amplification of peace. The enhancer of peace. The enhancers of peace. The enhancer of peace. The enhancement of peace. The enhancements of peace. The enhancement of peace. The magnifier of peace. The magnifiers of peace. The magnifier of peace. The magnification of peace. The magnifications of peace. The magnification of peace. The influencer of peace. The influencers of peace. The influencer of peace. The influence of peace. The influences of peace. The influence of peace. The emanator of peace. The emanators of peace. The emanator of peace. The emanation of peace. The emanations of peace. The emanation of peace. The converger of peace. The convergers of peace. The converger of peace. The convergence of peace. The convergences of peace. The convergence of peace. The aura of peace. The auras of peace. The aura of peace. The impression of peace. The impressions of peace. The impression of peace. The intelligence of peace. The intelligences of peace. The intelligence of peace. The sophistication of peace. The sophistications of peace. The sophistication of peace. The genius of peace. The geniuses of peace. The genius of peace. The polymath of peace. The polymaths of peace. The polymath of peace. The psychic of peace. The psychics of peace. The psychic of peace. The knowledge of peace. The knowledges of peace. The knowledge of peace. The understanding of peace. The understandings of peace. The understanding of peace. The wisdom of peace. The wisdoms of peace. The wisdom of peace. The secret of peace. The secrets of peace. The secret of peace. The mystery of peace. The mysteries of peace. The mystery of peace. The revelation of peace. The revelations of peace. The revelation of peace. The tactic of peace. The tactics of peace. The tactic of peace. The strategy of peace. The strategies of peace. The strategy of peace. The strength of peace. The strengths of peace. The strength of peace. The might of peace. The might of peace. The might of peace. The power of peace. The powers of peace. The power of peace. The authority of peace. The authorities of peace. The authority of peace. The dominion of peace. The dominions of peace. The dominion of peace. The rhythm of peace. The rhythms of peace. The rhythm of peace. The melody of peace. The melodies of peace. The melody of peace. The music of peace. The musics of peace. The music of peace. The lyric of peace. The lyrics of peace. The lyric of peace. The song of peace. The songs of peace. The song of peace. The dance of peace. The dances of peace. The dance of peace. The spirit of peace. The spirits of peace. The spirit of peace. The soul of peace. The souls of peace. The soul of peace. The body of peace. The bodies of peace. The body of peace. The mark of peace. The marks of peace. The mark of peace. The promise of peace. The promises of peace. The promise of peace. The visionary of peace. The visionaries of peace. The visionary of peace. The vision of peace. The visions of peace. The vision of peace. The picture of peace. The pictures of peace. The picture of peace. The sound of peace. The sounds of peace. The sound of peace. The tongue of peace. The tongues of peace. The tongue of peace. The language of peace. The languages of peace. The language of peace. The communication of peace. The communications of peace. The communication of peace. The people of peace. The peoples of peace. The people of peace. The society of peace. The societies of peace. The society of peace. The fortress of peace. The fortresses of peace. The fortress of peace. The government of peace. The governments of peace. The government of peace. The city of peace. The cities of peace. The city of peace. The nation of peace. The nations of peace. The nation of peace. The civilization of peace. The civilizations of peace. The civilization of peace. The world of peace. The worlds of peace. The world of peace.